Hello and welcome to another video podcast, Manna. I'm Pastor Jeff Glenn, and it's my pleasure to take you through the Bible. This week, we've been going through Genesis, and actually we're going to continue through Genesis. This week we pick up Genesis chapter 4, and as it so happens, there's four things that we're going to see from this chapter. And the first thing that we see is that you can't hide your sin from God. So just as in chapter 3, verse 9, when Adam and Eve had eaten from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, they were ashamed and they hid themselves in the garden from God and in an attempt to hide their shame. And so God said to them, "Where are you?" So the same thing happens in Genesis 4:10 after Cain kills Abel. And God said to Cain, "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground." And so God, we know that God knew where Adam was at in the garden. God is all-knowing. God is all-seeing, right? So God knew where Adam was at in the garden. And God knew that Cain had killed Abel. So why the question? And why is God asking Adam and Cain these questions? Well, it's for the same reason that your mama asked you a question, right? You can be assured that she knew the answer. She's just giving you a chance to come clean. So it's the same thing. God knew Adam's sin. God knew Cain's sin. And so he wanted them to know it. He wanted them to have that front in mind, to be confronted by it so that they could deal with it. Listen, we're unable to deal with sin unless we're confronted with it, unless we approach it straightforward, unless we acknowledge it. So once we've been confronted with it, we have two choices. We can either run from it, or we can agree with God that it's sin, that's called confession, and repent from it. And we see here that as we go on, we see Cain's response was to run. And the second thing we see is that God can't be approached or worshiped or honored through the sweat of our brow. He can only be approached or worshiped or honored by acknowledging Him. And so Cain offered the fruit of the ground to God as a sacrifice. And so Cain was a farmer, and I'm guessing that he probably brought God a zucchini. So I'm kidding, right? But it's harvest time here in Idaho, and every home gardener's zucchini is exploding, and it's really tough to get away because everyone has zucchini. And so that's that bad joke aside. Let's remember that Adam's curse in Genesis 3:17 through 19 says, "Cursed is the ground for your sake. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Both thorns and thistles it shall bring forth to you, and you shall eat the herb of the field. In the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, until you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken, for dust you are, and to dust you shall return." So this idea that Adam and humanity's supply for themselves would be frustrated, and that they would have to take out of the ground the food for them to eat out of much toil and sweat from the brow. And so for those home gardeners, you know that that's a lot of work to bring forth that little bit of food and those 5,000 zucchini. So this fruit of the ground was brought forth by the sweat of Cain's brow. And so it was through his effort that he brought his offering. So it was a prideful offering. Basically, Cain's saying, "Look what I've worked hard to accomplish. Look at what I've done. You should be proud of me, God." And so this sort of offering actually puts God in obligation to man because of man's efforts, right? So that's what was going on here, is Cain was putting God at obligation because of the work that he had done to produce this fruit of the ground. And so we can see that God can only be approached and worshipped and honored by acknowledging Him. And we see Abel's offering. So as a shepherd, he brought the firstborn of his flock as a sacrifice. And this mirrors God's covering of his parents' sin. And we see that in Genesis 3:14. So God offered to cover Adam and Eve with tunics of skin, which required, by extension of thought here, right, the sacrifice of an animal. An animal had to die in order for Adam and Eve's sin to be covered, their shame to be covered. And so only through shed blood, through an animal sacrifice, could atonement for sin be made. And actually just through a sacrifice could atonement be made. And so the third thing that we see is that Cain's actions left him and his descendants wandering. And we see that in Genesis 4:16. Then Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Nod on the east of Eden. And so Nod means wandering. And Cain's choice to leave the presence of God was just that, a choice. And so it led to him wandering. And so this wandering sounds familiar to me, right? And it will to you, right? Israel would spend their time wandering in the wilderness, also by their own choice. And so this applied to Cain's offspring. They would also wander. They would wander further from God, and their pride would increase. We see Lamech, right, in Genesis 4:24. Lamech is a descendant of Cain, and he had killed a man and knew that there would be consequences. But in his pride he declared, if Cain should be avenged sevenfold, then Lamech 77-fold. And so this posture of pride and self-seeking and self-protection, that's the pathway away from God. And it leaves one wandering and lost. And so the fourth thing that we'll see is it's a part A and part B here. Both things could be said. The first thing is the encouragement to call on the name of the Lord. And the second, combined to that, is that God's promises are sure. I could have said there's 5 things, but I thought Genesis 4 things anyway. So in Genesis 4:25 and 26, and Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and called his name Seth. For she said, God has appointed me for another offspring instead of Abel, for Cain killed him. To Seth also a son was born, and he called his name Enosh. And at that time, people began to call upon the name of the Lord. And so God had promised that the woman's seed would be the one to crush the serpent's head. And it couldn't be Cain because he was in league with the serpent, right? He was against his brother, and he deliberately walked away from God. And it wasn't Abel for obvious reasons. And so we see Seth born as the other offspring, a replacement for Abel, a fulfillment of the promise to bring about one who would crush the serpent's head. And indeed, we see in Jesus' genealogies, we see Seth. And so we see that from Seth's descendant Enosh, this phrase here, that people began to call on the name of the Lord. And so what a great example that is. We have these 2 examples, right? We have Cain, right, whose choice in the face of his sin was to leave the presence of God, to go and wander, and to be apart from God, and to be lost. And so that always leads to a worse state, right? So we see pride and the state of regarding yourself as oppressed and God as the oppressor, and that's just a bad road. Or we see Seth's example and his descendants, which was to move towards God, to acknowledge God, and to acknowledge God's providence in their life, and then commit to dependence on him. And so those are pretty clear choices. And have a great rest of your week. Bless you.